Okay, you'll understand the title by the end of my presentation, I hope. Atomism is, of course, the idea that all matter is comprised of atoms. It's an essentially a naturalistic or atheistic model because the supernatural is not composed of atoms, and so it doesn't actually exist. And obscurantism is just about obscuring the truth. I'm looking at it the way the truth is obscured through language, but also through coercion. Wittgenstein, I came to this topic as a linguist through the philosophy of language, and Wittgenstein is a good example. He said the philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. The meaning of a word and its use. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. So part of arguing is using words as they're conventionally understood. The philosophers of language held that many, if not all, disagreements could be resolved through clarity of language. I read about two different types of obscurantism. I mentioned coercion and also language used in a way to bewitch the intellect. And so I developed this taxonomy. I was reading about deliberate and abstruse kinds of obscurantism, and it led me to ask the question, well, can obscurantism be both deliberate and abstruse? And I came up with crypto-atomism as an example of something that would be deliberately abstruse. If someone was trying to avoid the gaze of the Inquisition, they might speak in metaphor in order to veil their atomism. But that would be very hard to document. I have some suspicions about Montaigne. He cited Lucretius at least 100 times, and his personal copy of On the Nature of Things, Lucretius's poem, it has the most impious passages marked in the margins, and also the editor of his edition warned the reader that the content might challenge their faith, but that if their faith is strong, they shouldn't worry. So, which seemed to be, it made me wonder if the editor was sort of winking at the reader as well as a crypto-atomist. And then I came up with a form that was neither deliberate nor abstruse, which would be sapiophobia. I say it's not deliberate because it's more reactive. It's sort of, for example, theologians who admired Cicero for his style, but gave up their guilty pleasure for fear of losing their faith. They're acting on sapiophobia. It's reactive, not deliberate, but it underlies their actions. So that would be something else that would be hard to detect. And it's not abstruse because they're deliberately depriving themselves. Because they're deliberately depriving themselves of the pleasure of reading those authors. Okay, so that's how I came up with this taxonomy. Obviously, self-deception would be allowing yourself to be deceived by language. And then suppression is the coercive form of deliberate obscurantism. It's not abstruse at all. It's pretty transparent. You burn heretics. And books. Some key elements of atomism are that indivisibles, there are particles that cannot be divided further. We'd say quarks, strings now. Theory's been updated. You also have to believe in the vacuum or the void in which the atoms move. Reductionism, meaning that everything reduces to atoms. And mechanism, meaning that there is no, that chance rules the universe. There is no divine intervention. There's no plan. A lot of philosophers talk about the hard problem of consciousness. It's not a hard problem so much as an intricate problem. the brain is so complex, the synapses are so many that it's hard to isolate brain activity to any more than just a region. You can't isolate a synapse. Victor Stenger points out that modern cognitive science fully supports the atomist view. There are elementary particles, such as mass and there are intrinsic properties of elementary particles, and there are secondary properties such as color and wetness that arise from the interaction of the particles. Also, neuroscience tells us that that consciousness is what the brain does. The mind is what the brain does. And so the idea of disembodied consciousness is not in concert with neuroscience. So that's the case for atomism. So also Victor Stenger points out that that Christianity embraced Plato and Aristotle, but suppressed the works of Epicurus. And I'm going to talk about also Lucretius, who was an Epicurean. Aristotle's fanboy, I think, would be a good description. Besides being a poet of great renown. Stenger also tells us that Erasmus and Thomas More both attempted to reconcile Epicurus and Lucretius with Christian thinking. And my position is that these Christian thinking and atomism are irreconcilable, and that atomism was bound to, that obscurantism was bound to occur. It was to be expected, because you can't reconcile the irreconcilable without speaking metaphorically or speaking in a misleading way, in a way that Wittgenstein would say, which is the intellect. Right. And this got me on, so I decided to look at Erasmus and Thomas More based on this citation from Stenger. And I'll return to them in a moment, but first I want to talk about how Renaissance humanism was characterized by obscurantism, but it wasn't unique. So I'm also going to talk about, I mentioned before that theologians embraced Plato and Aristotle. So how was that effort also obscurantist? And on the way I found skepticism and stoicism. And so I'm going to talk about each of those, and just so we can see that the obscurantism that characterized Renaissance humanism wasn't entirely unique. So I'm going to go in order. And so this, I think it's also worth noting that the more impious the philosopher was considered, the more effort there was to suppress that philosopher's works. And those impiety corresponds with monism, which is opposed to dualism. And it's materialism as opposed to idealism or supernaturalism. So Plato's idealism consisted of essentially the belief that matter was an illusion, that there must be some incorruptible, eternal forms from which matter was derived. And then Aristotle's metaphysics. He believed that the heavens and the earth were governed by different principles. He was also, according to Maimonides, he believed in a cosmic intelligence, sort of like the Stoics. So I would say that the element of Stoicism is really their animism, that sort of falls on this continuum between supernaturalism and materialism. And then skepticism, doubt, all the way to materialism, which is represented by Epicurus. And then over here, I think you can see gradually the distance becomes greater. As you become more naturalistic, the distance from theology is greater. So there's much more of a gulf to be bridged through obscurantism. Here we have the utterly irreconcilable, and then different gradations in between. Is everybody following that?
A lot on there.
Yeah. Okay, so this is from Stenger. Let's see, Augustine, following Plato, thought he'd solved the problem of creation out of nothing by saying that God created time along with the universe. This was how Augustine took Platonism and made it Christian. Neoplatonism, I think, is probably the most basic expression of supernaturalism. It's this idea that there must be something beyond what we understand, and here we say we see Plotinus quoted, "What motion of atoms can one attribute to the actions and passions of the soul?" So a Neoplatonist just didn't accept that chance ruled the universe. Okay. Aristotle essentially conceded the argument of final cause, that there must be an uncaused cause, which obviously was attractive to theologians, and they co-opted that message. And for a time, Aristotelian scholasticism was being taught as dogma. Thomas Aquinas actually used Aristotle's ideas about matter to explain transubstantiation. Aristotle was talking about accidents and substance of matter, and in atomistic terms we would talk about primary and secondary qualities. So that made it possible for us to experience bread even though the primary material is God. Okay. I think seems like a logical stretch, so I'm calling it obscurantism. Now, Maimonides is really interesting. I think if you want to get at obscurantism, you just have to see what people's critics were saying. And Aristotle said only a superficial and careless person would assume that Plato had the same ideas as monotheists. Also, he took issue with Aristotle's idea about cosmic intelligences, which I guess he would also take issue with the Stoics for that. And one proposition that was not negotiable for Maimonides was the eternity of the universe. And so we see here that Aristotle really wasn't compatible with Christianity, and Maimonides lays out the case. Here's a quote from Zeno that sums up the animism of the Stoics, that the universe is a living intelligence. It must be, because nothing which is devoid of life and intelligence can give birth to an intelligent creature. Augustine, his obscurantism, there's an example of obscurantism here where he essentially slandered Epicurus. Epicurus had a very moderate idea about pleasure. It's simply that it's very human to enjoy pleasure, and you shouldn't loathe your material existence because that's all there is, and it's essentially self-loathing. But they made him out to be an utter debaucher. Let's see, and then Augustine wished for certain philosophers, Thales, the Stoics, Epicurus, to disappear from collective memory. So he would have them, people forget them. And also, this is really interesting for me, that Augustine, he needed to believe in eternal reward and punishment in order to be a good boy. I mean, he unsuccessfully suppressed his carnal desires, and he essentially willed himself to believe in an afterlife in order to do that, which I think falls under the category of self-deception. Is that heretical enough, Paul, yet? Okay. But hardcore skepticism, I think, is represented by Sextus Empiricus. Since you need the body to do anything, God must be corporeal. He must be either a compound body, which is perishable, or simple, like water and fire, but that can't be an intelligent entity. So consciousness is essentially a consequence of biological complexity. We don't attribute intelligence to gravity or impersonal forces. And if those are the only two options, then God must be nothing. Academic skepticism, which is, Cicero was sort of between the Stoics and the skeptics. He conceived of a cosmic intelligence, but he ultimately thought God was unknowable. And he's one of the models that Erasmus followed for academic skepticism. And here's a quote from him: "Surely even those who believe that they have attained certainty must feel some doubts when they see how wise men have differed." And the methodology of academic skepticism was about arguing using textual evidence from the Bible, so the Bible was considered evidence. In Luther and Erasmus had sort of a correspondence and open letters going back and forth, where and Erasmus was unsuccessful in finding biblical support for free will, and Luther wanted to break with the church over free will, among other things like indulgences. And Erasmus really didn't. He thought that when there was room for doubt, you should just agree to disagree, and the church should stay together. So he wasn't really critical of Luther for being heretical. He was critical of him for wanting to break up the church. So, but then Erasmus couldn't really. He was pressured to publicly disagree with Luther, even though he couldn't find textual support for free will. And Erasmus said, I need the Jon Stewart, New Jersey mafia voice to adequately do this, where it's like a nice reformation you got there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. Erasmus essentially said it wouldn't be such a bad thing if Luther were boiled alive. So even though he didn't openly advocate, that sort of suppression, that deliberate sort of obscurantism, he said, it wouldn't be so bad. And then Luther had some choice words for Erasmus as well. Compared him to Lucian, a very atheistic writer, or some other pig from Epicurus' sty. So Epicurus was, he was weapons grade heresy. And his position was, we should assert our convictions. We should have the courage of our convictions. The Holy Spirit was no skeptic. And so he was critical of academic skepticism quite openly here. And then Epicurus insisted that the universe consists of bodies in the void, so he was a naturalist, he was an atheist, an atomist, and he also asserted very openly that there is no consciousness after death. So he believed in a mechanistic universe and that the soul dies with the body, which were the two things that that I mentioned before that were non-negotiable. Erasmus was known as the Prince of Humanists, and here is, I think, a very good example of his abstruse obscurantism. He pointed out that Epicurus means helper, and that Jesus was the ultimate helper, so he's like Epicurus in that sense. Pretty abstruse, I think. And then also that there's no more pleasurable existence than life in Christ. So he's trying to make these very, very tentative connections between Christian thinking and Epicureanism. And Lucretius expressed Epicureanism in poetic form On the Nature of Things. My preferred translation, though, is The Way Things Are. I kind of like, he has the courage of his convictions, like Luther said. So you can see here that Lucretius also held that chance ruled the universe, and there was no consciousness after death. Thomas More. Here we see the other kind of obscurantism, the coercive kind, the deliberate suppression of truth. In his novel Utopia, all citizens were encouraged to pursue pleasure. That was a nod to Epicurus. But if they thought that the soul dies with the body or the chance rules the universe, they were enslaved and they were imprisoned and enslaved. So again, those two ideas were just a bridge too far for Christian humanists. And More described himself as a Christian humanist, even though he oversaw the execution of 6 heretics while he was Lord Chancellor of England. Not the humanism we know today. No. So I think that what connects Epicurus' humanism, which was a humanism before the word humanism had been used, with Renaissance humanism and modern secular humanism is the idea of human autonomy. But within limits. You could only go so far. You couldn't assert that chance ruled the universe or that there was no afterlife. And then I end with Bertrand Russell, who was also a philosopher of language. And he said that where there is evidence, no one speaks of faith. We do not speak of faith that 2 and 2 are 4, or that the earth is round. We only speak of faith when we wish to substitute emotion for evidence. Also, you might remember Nietzsche said faith is not wanting to know what is true. And I have another great thinker here who I think was probably influenced by Nietzsche. Sorry, the sound's not up.
Hey, give me a beer, will you, Edith? Huh?
Billy.
All right.
Faith is something that you believe that nobody in his right mind would believe.